The mountain man with shoulders like split timber stood at the edge of Florence, Arizona, watching a woman in a faded calico dress kneel beside a shivering child and press something into his dirty hands, the last piece of bread she had been clutching moments before. Xander Finnegan had come down from the Superstition Mountains with a string of beaver pelts and enough loneliness weighing on him to crush a lesser man's spirit. It was early spring in 1878, and the desert town of Florence shimmered in the afternoon heat like a mirage that never quite disappeared. He had been watching the woman for only a moment, his dark eyes tracking her movements as she smiled at the barefoot boy despite the hollow look of hunger etched into her own delicate features. Her honey-colored hair had come loose from its pins, falling in waves around a face that might have been beautiful if it were not so gaunt. When she stood and smoothed her threadbare skirts, Xander saw her sway slightly, one pale hand reaching out to steady herself against the adobe wall of the general store. Something shifted in his chest, a feeling he could not quite name but recognized all the same. He had seen plenty of suffering in his 32 years, had watched men die in the mountains and women weep over graves in every settlement between here and Montana. But there was something about the quiet dignity in her gesture, the way she gave without hesitation, despite having nothing herself, that made him unable to look away. Xander moved through the dusty street with the easy confidence of a man who had spent more years among bears and mountain lions than people. His buckskin clothing marked him as an outsider, and the long, dark hair that brushed his shoulders drew stares from the more civilized townsfolk. His arms, corded with muscle from years of trapping and hauling, swung at his sides as he approached. He was a big man, standing well over 6 feet, with a broad chest and the kind of strength that came from surviving winters that would kill most men. The woman had started walking away, her steps unsteady, when Xander reached out and caught her elbow. She gasped and spun to face him, her gray-green eyes widening with alarm. Up close, he could see the fine bones of her face, the way her dress hung loose on what should have been a fuller frame, and the proud lift of her chin despite her obvious circumstances. "I am sorry to startle you, miss," Xander said, his voice rough from weeks of speaking only to himself and the wind. "But I just saw what you did for that boy." Her cheeks colored, a flush of pink that made her look younger than he had first thought. Maybe 23 or 24, he guessed. "It was nothing," she said, trying to pull her arm free. "The child was hungry. So are you." It was not a question. She stopped pulling and looked at him directly then, and Xander felt the full force of that gaze like a physical thing. "That is none of your concern, sir. Please release me." He let go immediately but did not step back. "When did you last eat?" "I hardly think." "Yesterday." 2 days ago." Her jaw tightened, and he saw her fighting the urge to simply walk away. But something kept her there, maybe the same something that had made him unable to turn his back on her. 3 days, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I will manage, I always do." Xander felt anger rise in him, though not at her. What kind of town let a woman like this go hungry? "The restaurant across the street," he said, gesturing with his head. "They serve a decent stew. You will join me." "I will not." The words came quickly, defensively. "I do not accept charity from strangers." "Then consider it payment," Xander said, already moving toward the restaurant and trusting she would follow. "I have been alone in those mountains for near 5 months, and I could use the company of someone who can string together more than 2 words. That is worth a meal, I reckon." He heard her small intake of breath behind him, heard the whisper of her skirts as she hesitated. Then, finally, the soft pad of her shoes following. Inside the restaurant, which was really just 4 tables in the front room of a boarding house, Xander pulled out a chair and waited until she sat before taking his own seat. The woman who ran the place, a round-faced Mexican woman named Rosa, came over with a smile that faded when she saw Xander's companion. "Mr. Finnegan," Rosa said warmly enough to him before turning cool eyes on the other woman. "Miss Fairmont." So she had a name. Maisie Fairmont, as he soon learned when Rosa grudgingly took their order for 2 bowls of beef stew, fresh bread, coffee, and whatever pie she had made that day. The woman Maisie protested the extravagance, but Xander ignored her and eventually she fell silent. When the food came, Xander had to force himself not to watch too obviously as Maisie tried to eat slowly, to maintain some semblance of dignity even as her body clearly cried out for sustenance. She managed it for about 3 bites before hunger won out, and she began eating with single-minded focus, her eyes closed as if in prayer. He ate his own meal and stayed quiet, giving her time. When she finally set down her spoon, having cleaned the bowl completely and eaten 2 thick slices of bread, she looked at him with tears standing in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "Tell me your story," Xander replied. Maisie folded her hands in her lap, those slender fingers with their ragged nails and calluses that spoke of hard work. "There is not much to tell. I came to Florence 2 years ago with my father. He was a school teacher and the town needed one. We were happy here, or happy enough. Then last winter he caught pneumonia and died within a week." She paused, swallowing hard. The town decided they did not need to pay a woman to teach, that it would be better to send the children to Tucson for schooling or have their mothers teach them at home. "I have been doing washing and mending when I can find it, but it is not enough," Xander finished. "No." She lifted her chin again, that gesture he was beginning to recognize as pure stubbornness. "But I will find something, I always do." The pie came then, thick slices of apple with cinnamon that made Maisie's eyes light up like a child's. Xander found himself watching the play of emotions across her face, the simple joy she took in something so basic, and felt that unnamed feeling in his chest grow stronger. "What were you doing giving away your last food if things are so dire?" he asked when she had finished half her slice, eating this one slowly, savoring it. Maisie looked up at him, and he saw steel beneath the softness. "That child is younger than me and has no parents at all. At least I have my wits and my health. What kind of person would I be if I kept food from someone worse off than myself?" "A sensible one," Xander said, but there was admiration in his tone. "I would rather be kind than sensible," Maisie said quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, the restaurant empty except for them and Rosa moving around in the back room. Outside, the Arizona sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that filtered through the dusty windows. "I have a proposition for you," Xander said finally, the words coming out before he had fully thought them through. "I need someone to help me with my supplies, sort through the pelts and get them ready to sell. It is work that takes delicate hands and a good eye for quality. I will pay you fair wages and meals while we work. No charity, just honest work for honest pay." Maisie studied him with those storm-colored eyes, and Xander felt as though she could see right through to the lie. He did not need help with the pelts. He had been preparing them himself for years and could do it in his sleep. But he kept his expression neutral, waiting. "How long would this work take?" she asked. "A week, maybe 2, depends on how fast you learn." And after that, Xander had not thought that far ahead. "After that, we will see. Maybe I need someone to help me set up camp for next season. Maybe the general store needs an extra hand. But 2 weeks of wages will be enough to keep you fed and housed for a good while, I would think." He could see her warring with herself, pride battling against necessity. Finally, necessity won. "Very well," Maisie said, "but I will earn every penny. I am not afraid of hard work." "I never thought you were," Xander said, and meant it. They made arrangements to meet the next morning at the livery stable where Xander had stored his supplies. When he walked Maisie back to the tiny room she rented above the dress shop, he saw the way people watched them, the whispers that followed. He knew what they were thinking, what conclusions they were drawing about a mountain man and a woman alone together. But Maisie kept her head high, and Xander found himself matching her pride with his own silent defiance of their judgment. That night, lying on a borrowed cot in the livery, Xander stared at the ceiling and wondered what he had gotten himself into. He had come to Florence to sell his pelts and buy supplies, planning to spend maybe 3 days in town, before heading back to the solitude he preferred. Now he had tied himself to a woman he barely knew, committed himself to 2 weeks of pretending he needed help he did not need, all because he could not stomach the thought of her going hungry again. He thought about the way she had smiled at that child, the genuine warmth in it despite her own suffering. Thought about the straightness of her spine as she faced down the whispers and stares. Thought about the intelligence he had seen in her eyes when she looked at him, seeing through his excuse, but accepting it anyway because she had no other choice. Xander had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to care about another person's well-being. But something about Maisie Fairmont had gotten under his skin in the space of a single afternoon. And he knew, with the certainty of a man who spent his life reading signs in nature, that his life had just changed in ways he could not yet understand. The next morning dawned clear and hot, the Arizona sun already baking the earth by the time Maisie arrived at the livery. She wore the same faded dress, but she had cleaned it as best she could and pinned her hair back neatly. Xander had already spread out his pelts on a large canvas sheet, the rich furs gleaming in the morning light. "These are beautiful," Maisie breathed, kneeling beside them. "I have never seen such quality. The Superstition Mountains have the best beaver in the territory," Xander said, crouching beside her. "But they need to be properly prepared for sale. See here, how this one has a slight tear. That needs to be sewn with sinew so fine you can barely see the stitches. And these need to be brushed out, cleaned of any debris." He spent the morning teaching her, showing her how to work with the furs without damaging them, how to identify the best quality, how to fold and stack them for transport. Maisie learned quickly, her hands deft and sure as she worked. They talked as they labored, small conversations at first, then deeper ones. He learned that she had grown up in St. Louis, the only child of parents who had valued education above all else. Her mother had died when she was 16, and her father had never quite recovered, eventually deciding to move west for a fresh start. She had read every book she could get her hands on, spoke a bit of French and German, and could recite poetry from memory. She learned that Xander had been born in Kentucky, had lost his own parents to cholera when he was 18, and had drifted west with nothing but a rifle and determination. He had tried his hand at mining, at ranching, at a dozen different things before finally finding his place in the mountains. He could track anything that moved, could survive for months with nothing but what he carried on his back, and preferred the company of eagles to most people he had met. "Most people, but not all?" Maisie asked, a small smile playing at her lips. Xander looked at her across the pile of furs, saw the way the sunlight caught in her hair and brought out the gold hidden in the honey brown. "Not all," he agreed. By midday, the heat was oppressive, and Xander suggested they break for lunch. He had bought food that morning, more than he needed, and spread it out between them: bread, cheese, dried meat, fresh peaches from the market. Maisie ate with better restraint this time, her stomach no longer quite so empty, but he saw the way she savored each bite, grateful for what she had. "Why do you live alone in the mountains?" she asked suddenly. "Do you not get lonely, Xander considered the question, cutting into a peach with his knife. Sometimes, he admitted, but people can be harder to bear than loneliness. In the mountains, things make sense. If you are cold, you build a fire. If you are hungry, you hunt. If something wants to kill you, it does not pretend to be your friend first. Maisie flinched slightly at that, and Xander wondered what experiences she had endured to make his words hit home. "I suppose that is true enough," she said quietly, "though I think I would go mad with no one to talk to. You get used to it. Start talking to yourself, to the animals. They are better listeners than most folks anyway." She laughed at that, a real laugh that lit up her whole face, and Xander felt something warm unfurl in his chest. He wanted to make her laugh like that again, wanted to see that light in her eyes instead of the shadows of hunger and worry. The days fell into a pattern. They worked together in the mornings when it was cooler. Xander teaching Maisie skills she would likely never need again, but learning them anyway with fierce determination. They talked about everything and nothing: books they had read, places they had been, dreams they had given up on or still harbored in secret. Xander made sure she ate well at every meal, watching as color began to return to her cheeks and the hollow look faded from her eyes. On the fourth day, while they were working in companionable silence, a man approached the livery. He was well dressed for Florence, with a silver watch chain and a hat that looked new. Xander recognized him as Richard Morrison, one of the wealthier merchants in town. "Miss Fairmont," Morrison said, his tone oozing false courtesy. "I heard you were working for the mountain man here. I wanted to offer you an alternative position. My wife needs a new housekeeper, and the pay would be better than whatever this savage is giving you." Xander felt his jaw tighten at the word savage, but he kept his expression neutral. It was Maisie's response he cared about. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Morrison," Maisie said coolly, not even looking up from the pelt she was working on. "But I am quite satisfied with my current employment." Morrison's face reddened. "Now see here, it is not proper for a lady like yourself to be alone with a man like that. People are talking." "People always talk," Maisie said, finally meeting his eyes. "I seem to recall them talking quite a bit when your business partner's money went missing last year, but that did not stop you from buying a new house." Morrison sputtered, his face going from red to purple. "How dare you? I think the lady asked you to leave," Xander said quietly, standing to his full height. He did not raise his voice, did not make any threatening moves, but something in his stillness made Morrison take a step back. "You have not heard the last of this," Morrison blustered, but he was already retreating. "The whole town knows what kind of woman takes up with a mountain man." Maisie's hands had stilled on the fur, and Xander saw her shoulders stiffen. When Morrison was gone, she resumed working, but her movements were jerky, angry. "Do not listen to him," Xander said. "I am not," Maisie said, but her voice was tight. "I am used to the talk. Ever since my father died and I had to move to that room above the dress shop, people have had plenty to say about me. Apparently a woman alone is either desperate or immoral, sometimes both. You are neither." She looked up at him then, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It does not matter what I actually am. It matters what they think I am. And working with you, spending time with you, it will only make it worse." Xander knelt beside her, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used. "Do you want to stop? I will understand if you do." Maisie shook her head fiercely. "No. This is the first time since my father died that I have felt like a person instead of just a problem to be solved or gossiped about. You treat me like I have a mind, like my opinions matter. I will not give that up just because small people have small thoughts." The warmth in Xander's chest was no longer unnamed. He knew what it was now, knew it as clearly as he knew which way north lay. He was falling in love with Maisie Fairmont, with her pride and her kindness and her refusal to be diminished by circumstance. "Then we will not worry about what they think," he said. "We will just keep on as we are." But it was not that simple, as Xander discovered over the next few days. The talk grew worse, not better. Women crossed the street to avoid Maisie when she walked to the boarding house for meals. The dress shop owner, a pinched-faced woman named Mrs. Schultz, told her she would have to find new lodgings by the end of the month. Even Rosa at the restaurant, who had been neutral if not friendly, began to give them cold looks when they came in together. Xander watched it all with growing anger, but Maisie bore it with that same quiet dignity she had shown from the beginning. She did not complain, did not cry where anyone could see, just kept her head high and went about her business. It was on the 9th day, as they were finishing up the last of the pelts, that Xander made his decision. "Come with me," he said abruptly. Maisie looked up from the fur she was folding. "Where?" "To the mountains. To my cabin." She stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "I cannot just go to the mountains with you, Xander. That would be better than staying here where they treat you like dirt," he said fiercely. "Better than being alone and hungry and looked down on by people who are not worth the dirt under your fingernails." "I would be completely ruined," Maisie said, but her voice was uncertain. "You are already ruined in their eyes," Xander pointed out. "At least in the mountains there would be no one to judge you but the sky, and I promise you, Maisie Fairmont, you would never go hungry again. You would never have to worry about where your next meal was coming from or whether you could pay your rent. I have enough for both of us, and more than enough space." "Why would you do that?" Maisie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you take on such a burden?" Xander moved closer, taking her small hands in his large, calloused ones. "Because you are not a burden. Because in the 9 days I have known you, you have made me feel less alone than I have in 10 years. Because when I think about going back to those mountains without you, it feels like something has been carved out of my chest." He took a breath, steadying himself. "Because I am in love with you, Maisie, and I think maybe you feel something for me too." Her breath caught, her fingers tightening on his. "I do," she admitted. "I have tried not to, tried to be sensible, but I do. You are the kindest man I have ever known, Xander Finnegan. The strongest and the gentlest all at once, but this is too fast, too sudden." "I have spent my life being patient," Xander said. "Waiting for the right moment to make a kill, waiting out storms, waiting for winter to break. I know about patience. But I also know that when something is right, you do not need to question it. This is right, Maisie. You and me, we fit." Tears spilled over then, tracking down her cheeks. "What about marriage? I will not live with a man unwed, Xander, no matter how much I care for him. I may be desperate, but I am not without principles." "Then marry me," Xander said simply. "Right now, today. We will find a preacher and make it proper, and then we will leave this town behind and start fresh. Just you and me and the mountains." Maisie searched his face, looking for doubt or deception and finding only honest feeling. "You would marry me? A woman you have known barely more than a week?" "I would marry you if I had known you barely more than a day," Xander said. "When you know, you know." She laughed through her tears, that bright, joyous sound he had grown to love. "Then yes, yes, I will marry you, you mad mountain man. I will marry you and go to your mountains and probably freeze to death in the winter, but I will do it gladly." Xander pulled her into his arms then, holding her close against his chest, feeling her heart beat against his. She fit perfectly there, her head tucked under his chin, her arms wrapping around his broad back. He breathed in the scent of her, lavender and sunshine and something uniquely Maisie, and felt more at home than he had ever felt in his life. They found the preacher that very afternoon, a circuit rider who happened to be passing through Florence on his way to Tucson. The man looked skeptical at first, this mountain giant and the too thin woman who wanted to be married immediately. But Xander paid him well, and his skepticism faded into practical acceptance. There were no guests at their wedding, no flowers or music or celebration. Just the two of them standing in the small adobe church as the sun slanted through the windows, promising to love and honor and cherish each other for the rest of their lives. Xander had to borrow a ring from the preacher, a simple gold band that was slightly too large for Maisie's finger, but she held her hand out proudly and let him slide it on. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Xander cupped Maisie's face in his hands and kissed her with all the tenderness he possessed. She kissed him back, her hands gripping his shoulders, and he felt her trembling against him. "Are you afraid?" he asked against her lips. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also happier than I have been in a very long time." They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, Xander paying Rosa extra for a room with a real bed and clean sheets. He was gentle with Maisie, patient despite his own want, making sure she felt safe and cherished. She came to him shy but willing, and he showed her with his hands and mouth and body how much she meant to him, how precious she was in his eyes. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Maisie traced the scars on his chest, the marks of a life lived hard. "Tell me about these," she said softly. So he did, sharing stories of close calls with bears, of accidents while trapping, of the general wear and tear of mountain life. She listened, her fingers gentle on his skin, and when he was done, she pressed a kiss over his heart. "I will worry about you now," she said. "Every time you go out, I will worry." "Then I will have to be more careful," Xander said, running his fingers through her hair. "I have something to come home to now." They left Florence 3 days later, Xander's horse packed with supplies and Maisie riding a gentle mare he had bought for her. The town watched them go with satisfaction, glad to be rid of the troublesome woman and her savage husband. Xander did not look back once, his eyes fixed on the horizon and the mountains beyond. But Maisie turned in her saddle, taking one last look at the place that had been her home for 2 years. "Any regrets?" Xander asked. She faced forward again, a smile on her lips. "Not a single one." The journey to Xander's cabin took 4 days, traveling at a pace that was easy on Maisie, who was not accustomed to long hours in the saddle. They camped under the stars at night, Xander teaching her how to build a proper fire, how to hobble the horses, how to read the night sky. She learned quickly, her mind sharp and eager for knowledge, asking questions that made him think about things he had long taken for granted. On the 3rd night, as they sat by the fire eating beans and salt pork, Maisie said, "Tell me about your cabin. What is it like?" Xander stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the darkness. "It is not fancy," he said. "One room mostly with a loft for sleeping. I built it myself from pine logs, chinked the gaps with mud and moss. There is a good stone fireplace, a table and chairs I made, a bed frame that could use a better mattress. The view looks out over a valley where deer come to graze in the mornings, and there is a stream nearby that never runs dry." "It sounds perfect," Maisie said sincerely. "It is lonely," Xander admitted, "or it was. I am hoping it will feel different with you there." "I will make it a home," Maisie promised. "If you teach me what I need to know, I will learn to be a proper mountain wife." Xander reached across the fire and took her hand. "You do not need to be anything but yourself. That is all I want." They reached the cabin on the 4th day, climbing up through pine forests as the air grew thinner and cooler. When they rounded the last bend and the cabin came into view, Maisie gasped with pleasure. It was exactly as Xander had described, a solid structure that looked like it had grown from the mountain itself, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. The valley stretched out below, green and lush with spring growth, and the stream sparkled in the afternoon sun. "Oh, Xander," Maisie breathed. "It is beautiful." He helped her down from the mare, pleased by her reaction. Inside, the cabin was dusty from months of disuse, but Maisie moved through it with interest, touching the hand-hewn furniture, examining the cast-iron stove, climbing the ladder to peek into the sleeping loft. "We will need to air it out," she said practically, "and give everything a good cleaning, but it is sturdy and well made. You did fine work here." Over the next few weeks, they settled into married life in a way that felt surprisingly natural. Xander taught Maisie everything he could about surviving in the mountains, how to hunt small game, how to identify edible plants, how to preserve meat and vegetables for the long winter. She taught him things too, reading aloud to him in the evenings from the small collection of books she had brought, sharing her knowledge of history and literature and ideas he had never encountered. He watched her bloom like a flower finally given enough water and sunlight. The hollow look left her completely, replaced by healthy curves and rosy cheeks. Her hands grew more calloused from work, but her eyes sparkled with contentment. She sang as she worked around the cabin, old songs her mother had taught her, and the sound filled the empty spaces Xander had not even known were there. At night, they came together with increasing passion and familiarity, learning each other's bodies and desires. Xander had been with women before, brief encounters in towns or mining camps, but nothing had prepared him for the intimacy of sharing his life with someone, of waking up next to the same person every morning and choosing her again every single day. Summer turned the valley into a paradise of wildflowers and abundant game. Xander took Maisie with him on some of his shorter expeditions, teaching her to track and to move quietly through the forest. She had a natural aptitude for it, learning to read signs. He pointed out a broken twig, a print in the mud, the way birds fell silent when a predator was near. One afternoon in late July, as they were checking his trap line together, Maisie suddenly stopped and put a hand on his arm. "Listen," she whispered. Xander went still, extending his senses. He heard it then, the low rumble of a bear somewhere close by. He moved in front of Maisie instinctively, his rifle coming up to his shoulder. The bear emerged from the brush about 50 yards away, a large brown female with 2 cubs trailing behind her. "Do not move," Xander murmured. "Do not run. She is just passing through with her young." They stood frozen as the bear family crossed the path ahead of them, the mother pausing briefly to sniff the air before herding her cubs into the forest on the other side. When they were gone, Maisie let out a shaky breath. "That was terrifying," she said. "That was mountain life," Xander replied, lowering his rifle. "You did well. Many would have panicked and run." "I trust you," Maisie said simply. "I knew you would keep us safe." By August, Maisie told him she was carrying his child. She broke the news one morning as they were eating breakfast, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "I am almost certain," she said. "All the signs are there." Xander felt a wave of emotion so strong it nearly knocked him off his feet. A child, his child, their child. He came around the table and pulled Maisie into his arms, holding her as carefully as if she might break. "Are you happy about it?" he asked. "So happy I could burst," Maisie said, her voice muffled against his chest. "Are you?" "Happier than I knew it was possible to be," Xander said honestly. "But also scared out of my mind. What if I am no good at it? What if I cannot provide enough?" Maisie leaned back to look at him, her hands framing his bearded face. "You are the best man I know, Xander Finnegan. You will be a wonderful father, and we will figure everything else out together." The knowledge that Maisie was pregnant changed something in Xander, made him even more protective and attentive. He insisted she rest more, take on lighter tasks. She protested at first, arguing that she was not an invalid, but eventually she accepted his care with good grace, understanding that it came from love and not a desire to control her. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Xander began preparing for winter with renewed urgency. He needed to make sure they had enough of everything to last through the cold months, enough food and firewood and supplies. The baby would come in late winter or early spring, and he wanted Maisie safe and comfortable. He also knew they would need help when her time came. Mountain winters could be brutal, and getting to a town for a doctor or midwife might not be possible. So in late September, he made the decision to take Maisie to Florence for the winter. "I do not want to go back there," Maisie said when he told her. "Those people were cruel to me." "I know," Xander said, "but I need you safe when the baby comes. We can stay at the boarding house, keep to ourselves. I will take whatever work I can find to pay our way. Then in the spring, when you and the baby are strong enough, we will come back to the mountains." Maisie looked around the cabin at the home they had made together and sighed. "You are right, of course, but I will miss this place." "It will be here waiting for us," Xander assured her. They arrived in Florence in early October, the desert town baking under a sky that seemed impossibly blue after the green of the mountains. Rosa at the boarding house raised her eyebrows when they asked for a room, but took their money readily enough. The news of their marriage had apparently made the rounds, along with the fact that Maisie was with child, and the town's attitude had shifted from judgmental to merely cool. Xander found work quickly, his strength and willingness to do hard labor making him valuable despite his rough appearance. He loaded and unloaded freight wagons, helped with construction, did whatever needed doing. Maisie, for her part, took in sewing and mending, her skilled fingers creating income even as her belly began to swell with their child. They kept to themselves as Xander had promised, ignoring the whispers and stares. But slowly, gradually, some of the women began to soften toward Maisie. They saw how devoted Xander was to her, how he walked her to and from the boarding house with his hand gentle on the small of her back, how he looked at her like she hung the moon. They saw that she was clearly loved and cared for, that whatever they had assumed about her character had been wrong. It was Mrs. Chen, the wife of the Chinese laundry owner, who first extended genuine friendship. She had 5 children of her own and took pity on Maisie, offering advice about pregnancy and childbirth, lending her maternity clothes, and generally treating her with kindness. Other women followed her lead, and by December, Maisie had a small circle of friends who would gather for tea and conversation. Xander watched his wife come alive in a different way, saw how she blossomed with female companionship after months of having only him to talk to. He was glad for it, glad she would have support when her time came, even if part of him missed having her all to himself. Winter in Florence was mild compared to the mountains, though the nights grew cold enough to require fires and blankets. Maisie grew rounder and more uncomfortable as the weeks passed, her feet swelling, her back aching. Xander did what he could to ease her discomfort, rubbing her feet at night, helping her find comfortable positions to sleep, making sure she never wanted for anything. In late February, as the desert began to show the first hints of spring, Maisie's labor began. It started as a backache that she initially dismissed, having had similar pains before. But by evening, the pains had become regular contractions, and Xander sent for Mrs. Chen and the local midwife, a capable woman named Sarah Hogan. The next 20 hours were the longest of Xander's life. He stayed by Maisie's side throughout, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement even as fear gnawed at his gut. He had seen animals give birth dozens of times, had even helped when needed, but this was different. This was Maisie, his beloved wife in pain and danger, and he was helpless to do anything but watch. When their son finally entered the world with a lusty cry, Xander felt tears stream down his face. Maisie, exhausted and sweating, reached for the baby with trembling arms, and Mrs. Hogan placed him in her embrace. He was red and wrinkled and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and strong lungs that he was using to voice his displeasure at being evicted from his warm home. "We have a son," Maisie said wonderingly, looking up at Xander with joy shining in her tired eyes. "We have a beautiful, healthy son." Xander bent and kissed her forehead, then pressed his lips gently to his son's fuzzy head. "What should we name him?" he asked. They had discussed names over the winter, but nothing had felt quite right. Now, looking at his son's determined little face, Xander said, "What about Thomas? It was my father's name." "Thomas Finnegan," Maisie said, testing it out. "Yes, I like that. Strong and solid like his father." Little Thomas was indeed strong, nursing well and gaining weight quickly. Maisie recovered from the birth with the resilience Xander had come to expect from her, and within a few weeks, she was eager to discuss returning to the mountains. "Not until you are fully healed," Xander said firmly. "And not until Thomas is a bit older. The journey is hard, and I will not risk either of you." So they stayed in Florence through March and into April, Xander working and saving every penny he could, Maisie caring for their son and slowly regaining her strength. The town had fully accepted them by now, charmed by the sight of the fierce mountain man cradling his tiny son with such gentleness, touched by the obvious love between husband and wife. In late April, when wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the desert and Thomas was 2 months old, they finally made the journey back to the mountains. It took longer this time, with frequent stops to tend to the baby, but Xander did not mind. He watched Maisie nurse their son under the stars, saw her face when she first caught sight of the cabin again, and felt complete in a way he never had before. The cabin welcomed them back like an old friend. Inside, everything was as they had left it, perhaps a bit dustier but intact. Maisie walked through the rooms with Thomas in her arms, pointing out windows and furniture, telling him about his new home. Life settled into a new rhythm, one shaped around the needs of a baby. Thomas was a good child, not overly fussy, and he seemed to thrive in the mountain air. Xander built a cradle for him and carved small toys, watching in wonder as his son grew and changed almost daily. Maisie proved to be as capable a mother as she was a wife and partner. She managed the demands of caring for an infant while still helping with the daily work of survival, and she did it all with good humor and grace. On the rare occasions when she was overwhelmed, Xander was there to take the baby, walking him around the cabin or sitting on the porch, telling Thomas stories about the mountains while the infant stared at him with serious eyes. That summer was one of the happiest times of Xander's life. He would take Thomas with him on short walks, the baby strapped to his chest in a sling Maisie had sewn, pointing out birds and trees and teaching him the names of things, even though the child was far too young to understand. Maisie would sometimes join them, the three of them exploring their valley together, a family complete and content. In the evenings, after Thomas was asleep in his cradle, Xander and Maisie would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains. These were the moments Xander treasured most, when they could talk about their days, make plans for the future, or simply sit in comfortable silence. "You ever regret it?" Xander asked one evening. "Leaving Florence, leaving civilization for this rough life?" Maisie looked at him in genuine surprise. "Not for a single moment. This life with you, with our son in this beautiful place, this is more than I ever dreamed I could have. You saved me, Xander, not just from hunger, but from a life of loneliness and judgment and slow despair." "You saved me too," Xander said, pulling her close against his side. I was existing, not living. You taught me the difference. As Thomas grew into a toddler, curious and fearless, Xander found himself thinking about the future more concretely. The cabin was big enough for now, but if they had more children, they would need more space. He began planning an addition, sketching it out in the evenings, discussing it with Maisie. 2 more rooms, he said, showing her his rough drawings. 1 for the children, and 1 that could be a proper study for you with shelves for your books. Children? Maisie asked, raising an eyebrow. Plural? I hope so, Xander said. If you are willing. I always imagined Thomas would want brothers and sisters. Maisie smiled and placed his hand on her stomach. Then it is fortunate that he will have at least 1. I am with child again. The joy Xander felt was no less than the first time, though perhaps tempered with a bit more confidence. He knew what to expect now, knew what Maisie would need. He began the addition immediately, working on it whenever time allowed, determined to have it finished before the new baby arrived. Their daughter was born the following spring, in the cabin this time with only Xander to help. He had insisted they go to Florence again, but Maisie had refused, saying she trusted him more than any midwife. It was harder than watching had been, actually being responsible for the birth, but Xander managed, drawing on everything he had seen in half-remembered instructions from Sarah Hogan. When he placed the squalling infant in Maisie's arms, healthy and whole, he felt pride and relief in equal measure. What should we call her? Maisie asked, studying their daughter's tiny face. You choose, Xander said. I named Thomas. Martha, Maisie said after a moment. After my mother. Martha Elizabeth. Little Martha was different from Thomas, more delicate, more prone to fussing. But she was also sweet-natured, quick to smile, and she wrapped Xander around her tiny finger from the first moment she gripped his large finger with her small hand. Thomas, now an energetic 2-year-old, was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to touch her and bring her things. The years flowed by like water, each one bringing changes and challenges. They had 1 more child, another son they named Samuel, making their family complete at 5. The addition Xander had built was expanded further, until the cabin had become a proper house, with separate bedrooms and space for everyone. Xander continued to trap and hunt, providing for his family, but as the children grew, he found himself taking fewer long trips, unwilling to be away from them for extended periods. Maisie taught all 3 children to read and write, determined they would have the education she and Xander valued. She used her own books, and any others Xander could bring back from his occasional trips to Florence, creating a small school right there in the mountains. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved the woods as much as his father did, following Xander everywhere and learning everything he could about tracking and surviving. Martha was the dreamer, always with her nose in a book, making up stories and poems. Samuel was the wild card, equally at home in the forest or with his mother's books, charming and quick-witted. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters when supplies ran low, illnesses that scared them, accidents that could have been serious but mercifully were not. But through it all, Xander and Maisie faced everything together, their love for each other only growing deeper with time. On their 10th anniversary, Xander surprised Maisie with a ring he had commissioned in Florence, a proper wedding ring to replace the borrowed one she had worn all these years. It was silver with a small turquoise stone, nothing fancy, but Maisie cried when he slipped it on her finger. You did not need to do this, she said, but she was smiling through her tears. I wanted to, Xander said. I wanted you to have something beautiful, something that showed the world how much I love you. I already have everything I need, Maisie said, gesturing around at their home, at their 3 children playing nearby. but I will treasure this always." As the children grew older, the question of their future began to loom larger. Thomas was 12 now, Martha 10, and Samuel 8. They were good children, well-educated and capable, but Xander worried about their opportunities. Life in the mountains was wonderful in many ways, but it was also limiting. "Maybe we should think about spending winters in town," Maisie suggested one evening. "The children could attend proper school, have friends their own age. We could come back to the mountains in the summers." Xander was initially resistant to the idea, but he could see the wisdom in it. And so they began a new pattern, spending the warm months in their mountain home and the cold months in Florence. They bought a small house there, using years of saved money, and the children thrived with the change. Thomas discovered he had a gift for mathematics, something that surprised everyone. Martha's love of stories led her to help the town's printer, learning to set type and eventually writing articles for the small newspaper. Samuel made friends everywhere he went, his easy charm and quick mind making him popular with adults and children alike. Through it all, Xander and Maisie remained each other's anchors. They had grown older together, Xander's hair now showing threads of gray, lines forming around Maisie's eyes from years of laughter. But when Xander looked at his wife, he still saw the woman who had given away her last piece of bread, who had chosen to trust him when she had every reason not to, who had built a life with him in the wilderness and made it sing with joy. "You remember the day we met?" Maisie asked one evening as they sat together on the porch of their Florence house. The children were inside, doing their schoolwork, and the desert sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Every detail," Xander said. "You were giving that boy your last bit of food, and I thought you were the most stubborn, foolish, beautiful thing I had ever seen." Maisie laughed. "I thought you were terrifying. This huge mountain man with all that hair and those muscles, looking at me like you could see straight through me." "I could," Xander said. "I saw your heart that day, Maisie. I saw your kindness and your strength, and I knew I could not walk away from you." "Best decision you ever made," Maisie said, teasing. "Best decision we both made," Xander corrected, pulling her close, "choosing each other every day." As more years passed, their children began to make their own paths. Thomas, at 18, decided he wanted to study engineering, having developed a fascination with bridges and buildings. Xander and Maisie helped him get into a school in Denver, proud and heartbroken in equal measure when he left. Martha, at 16, had already published several stories in regional newspapers and was talking about becoming a real writer. She was being courted by the printer's son, a nice young man named David Whitmore, and Xander had to restrain his protective instincts every time the boy came calling. Samuel, at 14, was still figuring out what he wanted, bouncing between different interests with the enthusiasm of youth. But he was smart and capable, and Xander had no doubt he would find his way. One spring, when they were preparing to head back to the mountains for the summer, Martha announced she was engaged to David and wanted to be married in the fall. Maisie cried with happiness, and even Xander had to admit the boy was worthy of his daughter. The wedding was held in Florence, a beautiful ceremony that brought together everyone they had known over the years. Watching Martha marry, seeing her joy and David's obvious adoration, Xander felt time collapse. It seemed like only yesterday she had been a baby in his arms, and now she was a woman starting her own family. He danced with her at the reception, this grown daughter of his, and had to swallow past the lump in his throat. "Be happy," he told her. "That is all I want for you." "I learned from the best," Martha said, glancing over to where Maisie was laughing with Mrs. Chen and some of the other women. "You and Mother showed me what real love looks like." 2 years later, Thomas married a clever girl he met in Denver, and they settled there, Thomas working for a firm that designed bridges. He brought his wife to visit the mountain cabin, and she was appropriately awed, though Xander could tell mountain life was not for her. That was fine. Thomas was happy, and that was what mattered. Samuel, at 18, shocked them all by deciding to become a doctor. He had always been squeamish around blood, but apparently an incident involving a mining accident and the town doctor had changed something in him. He apprenticed with the Florence doctor before heading to medical school, determined and focused in a way he never had been before. And then it was just Xander and Maisie again, their children grown and gone, living their own lives. They sold the Florence house and moved back to the mountains full-time, finding peace in returning to where they had started. The cabin felt both empty and full, echoes of children's laughter still seeming to ring in the rooms even though the actual children were far away. But Maisie filled it with her presence, and Xander was content to spend his days with her, doing the simple work of living that they had always done together. Their children visited when they could, bringing grandchildren for Xander and Maisie to spoil. Thomas and his wife had 2 daughters. Martha and David had a son and a daughter, and Samuel eventually married a fellow doctor and they had twin boys. The cabin would fill with noise and chaos during these visits, and Xander loved every moment of it, even as he was exhausted by the end. But he also loved the quiet that returned when they left, the peace of having just Maisie to himself again. They would sit on the porch as they had done for decades, watching the sun set, talking about the children and grandchildren, making plans for the garden or repairs to the cabin. "We did well," Maisie said one evening, her hand in his. She was 60 now, her hair more silver than honey, her face lined with age. But to Xander, she was as beautiful as the day he had first seen her. "We did," he agreed. He was 62, his body not quite as strong as it once was, his joints aching in the cold. But he could still hunt, still provide, still take care of his wife. "You ever think about how different your life would have been if you had not seen me that day?" Maisie asked. "If you had just sold your pelts and gone back to the mountains," Xander considered it. "I would have survived," he said finally. "But I would not have lived. Not really. You gave me a life worth living, Maisie. You gave me love and family and purpose beyond mere survival." "You gave me everything," Maisie said softly. "When I gave away that bread, I was at the end of my rope. I did not think I could go on much longer. And then you appeared, like something out of a story, and you made sure I never had to go without again. You kept your promise, Xander." "I always will," he said, meaning it with everything in him. They had several more years together, peaceful years full of the simple joys of companionship and shared history. They watched their grandchildren grow through letters and visits, celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, and generally lived the quiet life they had always wanted. Xander went first, dying peacefully in his sleep at 68 after a day spent working in the garden with Maisie. She found him in the morning, still and cold, and though she grieved, she also took comfort in the fact that he had lived exactly the life he wanted and died in the place he loved most. Their children came for the funeral, burying him on the mountainside overlooking the valley where deer still came to graze. They wanted Maisie to come live with one of them, to leave the cabin and the mountains, but she refused. "This is my home," she said firmly. "This is where your father and I built our life, and this is where I will stay." She lived there for 3 more years, tending the garden, reading her books, and writing letters to her children and grandchildren. Sometimes, she would sit on the porch and talk to Xander as if he were still there, telling him about the news from town, or what the deer had been doing that morning. When she died at 73, it was also peacefully. sitting in the rocking chair Xander had made for her 40 years before, a book open in her lap. They buried her next to Xander on the mountainside, and all three of their children, with their spouses and children, stood together and remembered the love story that had started with a piece of bread given away and had grown into a legacy of kindness and devotion that would live on through generations. The cabin stood empty after that, too remote and rustic for any of the children to want to maintain full time. But they visited it, especially on anniversaries and special occasions, bringing their children and eventually grandchildren to see where their grandparents had built their life together. Thomas's daughters would sit on the porch and imagine their grandmother as a young woman, hungry and desperate, meeting the mountain man who would change her life. Martha's children would explore the woods, following trails their grandfather had walked countless times. Samuel's twins would study the hand-hewn furniture, the careful craftsmanship, and understand that love could be built as surely as walls and roofs. The story of Xander and Maisie became family legend, told and retold with each generation. The mountain man who had seen a woman give away her last bread and had made sure she never went without again. The woman who had chosen trust over fear and built a life in the wilderness. Two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment and had chosen each other every day for the rest of their lives. In the end, that was their legacy, more valuable than any fortune, more lasting than any monument. They had loved deeply and truly, had raised good children who became good adults, had shown through their actions what it meant to honor the promises you make and cherish the people you love. The mountains kept their secrets, but the cabin remained, a testament to what can be built when two people join their lives together with purpose and devotion. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light was just right, you could almost imagine you saw them there on the porch, the mountain man and his beloved wife, watching the sun set over the valley they had called home, together in the place where they belonged, where they had always belonged, from that first moment when kindness had called to kindness, and two lonely souls had found their way to each other at last.